She entered the courtroom as if she didn't belong there. No attorney by her side, no briefcase clutched to her arm. Just a simple gray dress, an unmoving stare, and something in her eyes that froze people in mid-sentence. Most didn't even see her at first. She seemed too young, too motionless. But when she came forward to speak, the room was silent. Was she? Why had she appeared alone? And what was the truth she bore that caused a judge to lean forward without one objection? This is not the sort of story that hits the headlines. Not quite. There are no stars in court. No blinding cameras outside the courthouse anticipating someone to tumble. It's more subdued than that, more human, and somehow more compelling. For this story is about a daughter and a father, a decent man, unassuming and humble, who had spent his life helping others from the confines of a vehicle, until one day it was all stolen from him with a mere charge. He didn't strike back. He didn't retaliate. He simply sat there, hands crossed, too proud to beg for mercy, too truthful to play games. But someone else wasn't so willing to remain silent. Sometimes the ones who speak the softest hold the most truth. And sometimes it is someone young, not yet jaded by the world, to speak what others are too afraid to speak. What would you do if the one you loved was being squeezed by a lie? Would you hold your silence and hope that justice would prevail? Or would you risk everything, your reputation, your voice, your position in the world, to bring the truth to light? This novel poses that question, and in the answer, you'll find something deeper than courtrooms and accusations. You'll find love, courage, and the quiet, unshakable strength of a daughter who chose to stand when no one else would. You may not know her name. You may not have read her story in the news. But when you hear what she did, when you accompany her through every second of doubt, fear, and hope, you'll see why the people who were present that day still speak about her. Not about the billionaire, not about the scandal, but about the girl in the gray dress, the one who gave truth a voice. Now let me tell you the complete story. Nobody thought that she would walk in. The courtroom was half full already that morning. Attorneys were drinking coffee, scanning their notes. The prosecutor was thumbing through files. The judge wasn't even on the bench yet. Everyone was speaking in hushed tones, all about the sensational case on the calendar, a career private driver, Clarence Thompson, charged with felony theft. Then the doors swung open, and in walked a girl, not a woman in a power suit, not some smooth and polished product of a team of attorneys. She had to be no more than 19, perhaps 20, hair tied back in a loose braid, backpack over one shoulder. She wasn't attired like a woman who was about to wage war in a courtroom. She was the kind of person who might run out of the house before dawn, shoes battered, sleeves creased, wearing a simple gray dress that did not quite fit. It was too large across the shoulders, as if it had belonged to her mother, or perhaps a church hand. Me, down. For a second, she was ignored by everyone. A couple of glances, perhaps an elevated eyebrow. She appeared to be a high school student who had gone down the wrong path and stumbled into the real world. And then she approached the front of the courtroom, not to sit in the spectator gallery, not to blend in with the back. She proceeded to the middle. The clerk began to talk, but she raised her hand, gentle, calm, steady, like she had rehearsed this scene 100 times in her head. The judge appeared just as she took a step forward, and when he looked at her, he didn't glimpse a lost child. He didn't glimpse a lost child. He glimpsed fire in her eyes. It was not arrogance, and it was not fear. It was something more. Determination. Resolve. "My name is Zaria Thompson," she told him. Her voice wasn't raised, it was simply firm. "And I'm here to represent my father." The judge blinked, puzzled. "Miss Thompson, you're not listed. Do you have representation?" She shook her head. "No, Your Honor, I don't." "Are you an attorney?" "No, sir," she replied, remaining unruffled. "I am not a lawyer, but I know the truth. But I know the truth." A whispered murmur spread throughout the courtroom. Someone coughed up a lung. The prosecutor finally looked up from his files, peering over the tops of his glasses at her. The defense attorney appeared as surprised as anyone else. The judge removed his glasses, looking at her intently. "You see, Miss Thompson, this is a court of law. What you say today has consequences." "Yes, sir," she replied softly. "That's why I'm here." Her fingers were clasped together in front of her, knuckles pale, fingers tight. If she was afraid, she didn't give any sign. If she was afraid, she didn't give any sign. She stood by herself, no mother standing next to her, no lawyer advising her, just a young woman who had come alone, driven by something greater than fear. Conviction. And for one moment, only long enough to be important, the courtroom came to a total standstill. The judge leaned forward a little. "Go on," he instructed. That was when everything began to shift, because what Zaria was about to say would change the whole direction of the trial. It would shake lawyers, surprise witnesses, and raise questions no one wanted raised. But all that didn't count to her at the moment. She wasn't there to get her picture in the newspaper. She wasn't there to humiliate anyone. She was there because the man in the defendant's chair, Clarence Thompson, was her dad. And no one else was struggling for him. Not that she wasn't trying. She had sat in court yesterday, following the trial like a slow motion unwinding of agony. She had heard the prosecutor paint her father as a criminal, a reserved man with no police record, suddenly accused of swiping expensive pieces of jewelry from a billionaire client. Pieces that had more value than their family had ever seen in an entire lifetime. Clarence had not said much on his behalf. That was the nature of the man, humble, quiet, a man who thought that truth would be heard louder than words. But Zaria knew better. Sometimes the truth needed assistance. Sometimes it needed someone to voice what others chose to remain silent about. She'd spent all night running the evidence over and over in her mind, reading over old records, watching courtroom tapes, and rummaging through her father's cache of stored camera files from his vehicle. She hadn't attended law school, but she knew her father. She knew what sort of man he was, and she knew that if nobody stood up for him, nobody would. So she went into court, wearing her mother's dress, with truths in her backpack the court had not yet heard, and a voice that was ready to be heard. She drew in breath, and when she opened her mouth once more, even the old judge, accustomed to decades of hard cases, veteran attorneys, and courtroom theatrics, leaned forward just a little in his seat because he sensed something was on its way, something real, something surprising. And none of them, not the prosecutor, not the bailiff, not the subdued man in handcuffs who had sat across the room, would ever remember what she was going to say next. Zaria stood before the court. No script, no notes, no legal precedent, just her voice. The room fell silent, as if everyone had forgotten to breathe. Even the judge, who'd heard every type of case come through his courtroom, from mundane hearings to blockbuster corporate fraud, was listening to her now with quiet interest. Zaria didn't sound like a lawyer. She didn't sound like she used polished arguments or courtroom jargon. But what she said was real. She started with the one that made every head in the room turn. Mr. Carlisle Hayes. Hayes was not anyone. He was a billionaire real estate tycoon, a fixture in shiny magazines, a contributor to local causes, a guest lecturer at benefit galas. In front of the camera, he was all charm and finish. He shook hands. He grinned with his entire face. He was the type of guy people wanted to believe. But Zaria's depiction differed. My father worked for Mr. Hayes for nearly 15 months, she explained. He chauffeured him around day and night meetings, dinner, out-of-town events. He familiarized himself with his routines, habits, and temper. She stopped, her hands folded tightly in front of her. I remember the first time my father ever came home late, she went on. He had that look on his face. Not like he was exhausted, but like something in him had been walked on. He wouldn't discuss it, just sat silently at the table, hardly eating. She glanced over at her father, now sitting up straighter than he had been, his eyes fixed on hers, a look of disbelief crossing his face. I learned later that Mr. Hayes had yelled at him in front of other employees, Zaria explained. Over something trivial, over something my father hadn't even done. But that wasn't the end of it. She had shared recollections, whispered recollections that hadn't found their way into any formal report. Moments Clarence had returned home with his collar ripped, his demeanor lower than normal. He never told me so, she told us, but I knew. I could tell by the way he smiled less often, the way he let out big sighs when he thought he was alone. Mr. Hayes didn't treat him like a man, like a father. He treated him like he was something you used and then threw away. She caught her breath and spoke the words that rocked the whole room. Night before my dad was arrested, I happened to overhear a phone call. All eyes in the courtroom went up. I was passing through the kitchen, she said. He didn't realize I was there. He was speaking on the phone in very low tones, too low to discern the other voice. But I caught him saying, I won't lie for you. I can't do that. I have a daughter. She's watching me. A hush fell over the courtroom. And just like that, the weight of her words filled the air like fog. The next day, Clarence was pulled over, and the police found thousands of dollars worth of jewelry in his trunk. Jewelry that matched items reported missing from one of Hayes' recent parties. Zaria looked around the courtroom, slowly, carefully. You believe that's coincidence? She asked, tone firm. My father would not lie, and the next day, stolen diamonds appear in his car. She shook her head. No, that wasn't random. That was a warning. Or worse, it was payback. The courtroom came to life. Some reporters started writing more quickly. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, lips compressed into a thin line. Even Clarence appeared shaken, his unclasped hands now resting on the table, his head cocked forward slightly. It was the first time he seemed less the man resigned to his own destiny, and more the man realizing it may not be finished after all. The judge cleared his throat again. "Miss Thompson," he said slowly, "are you accusing Mr. Hayes of setting up a setup for your father?" "I'm telling you someone did," Zariah answered firmly, "and I know that my father didn't do it." She stood up to confront the judge. "My father's never missed a payment, never a violation of the law, never got anything more than he earned working hard and honestly. We weren't prosperous, but he ensured we were never starving, ensured I had school textbooks, a winter coat, a reason to be proud to bear my name." She took a moment to pause once again, so when I heard what the cops discovered, I didn't believe it, not for a second. I knew something was off. That's why I began investigating. I read every report, every allegation, every accusation in this case, and I discovered things that don't add up. Timelines that don't match, records that weren't checked twice, people who claimed to have been at the party but weren't. The prosecutor started to stand up from his seat, but the judge held up his hand to get him to stay seated. "Let her finish." Zariah smiled her gratitude. "I'm not exactly a lawyer," she said, "but I do know my father. I know what he's like, and I know that if we don't begin asking the right questions, the wrong people will continue to get away with this." Her tone did not rise. She didn't scream. But what she said was more effective than anything that had been said all week. Even the defense lawyer, who had been quiet until now, sat up straight in his chair, looking at her with a fresh respect. There was no doubt this young woman, with no legal training, had done something remarkable. She'd planted doubt. And doubt in a courtroom is everything. The judge rested back in his chair, clasping his hands together. He regarded Zariah for a moment, then turned to the prosecutor. "Do you have any rebuttal to this testimony?" he asked. The prosecutor paused. Zariah took a glance at her father. Clarence's eyes were glassy, but his face was proud. For the first time since the arrest, he seemed as if the burden bearing down on him had started lifting. Albeit just barely, because his daughter had done what no one else would. She'd stood up, spoken out, and cracked open a truth that no one in that courtroom had wanted to examine prior, and that altered everything. Zariah wasn't finished. She had already shocked the courtroom with what she had said, already shaken the quiet that had enveloped her father's case for weeks, but she wasn't the kind to go halfway. Not when the truth was still lingering just beneath the surface waiting to be spoken. And so after a moment of hesitation, Zariah looked back at the judge. "Your Honor," she continued, "I have something else. One bit of evidence that I discovered after sorting through my dad's old dashcam footage." The judge's eyebrows shot up. "You have physical evidence?" "Yes, sir. From the day prior to him getting arrested." The room shifted. She reached into her backpack, the same one she'd worn through every day of trial, packed with printed court documents, highlighted pages, and her father's papers, and produced a tiny black USB drive. The prosecutor shifted forward slightly. The bailiff walked over to get the device and handed it to the clerk. It was plugged in quickly into the court's display system. Zariah indicated towards the screen at the front of the courtroom. "I'd like everyone to see this," she said. The screen flickered, then came to life. It was raw footage, no dramatic angles, no edits, just the interior camera view from Clarence's dashboard. The timestamp in the corner reads 6:48 p.m., the night before he was pulled over. The court watched silently. Through the front windshield, they had a view of Carlisle Hayes' estate driveway, which was long and curved. Lights in the mansion shone in the background. Then from the side, the passenger door swung open. Carlisle Hayes came into view. He didn't look at all like the groomed individual on the cover of magazines or on the front page of newspapers. His jacket was unbuttoned. His tie was loose around his neck. His eyes swept back and forth like a man glancing over his shoulder. He leaned forward a little toward Clarence. "You still got that package, don't you?" Hayes whispered, but he spoke clearly. "Just hold on to it for now." "Don't touch it." Clarence didn't say a word, didn't nod, didn't frown, but there was a pause, long enough, and then, just barely, the slightest silent nod, tired, maybe confused, but compliant. Hayes settled back into his seat. "That's it. Nobody has to know anything, just drive." Zariah advanced and stopped the footage with a tiny remote in her hand. The frame froze. Hayes interrupted in the middle of a sentence. Clarence, silent, the instant frozen in time. Zariah turned to face the courtroom. "My dad didn't know what was inside that box," she explained, "but Mr. Hayes did. That's when he planted the evidence. That's when he made my dad a scapegoat." Silence. Complete, eerie silence. The defense lawyer, who had until then played second fiddle to Zariah's blaze, slowly eased back into his chair, his face pale. The prosecutor's was white as well, and Clarence sat with his eyes fixed on the screen as if he was witnessing something he had worked hard to erase from his memory. The judge cleared his throat, clearly shaken. "Miss Thompson," he repeated, very slowly, "was this video ever produced in discovery?" "No, sir, it wasn't. My dad had no idea the camera was still recording to back it up. He believed it had stopped months and months ago." She unfolded a printed report from the dashcam software. "I discovered it in an archive folder in his cloud account. The video had been automatically recorded the night of the accident. Time-stamped, geotagged, unedited. He never checked it. But I did." The judge signaled the bailiff to accept the printed papers. He read over the cover and then handed it to the clerk. "Zariah wasn't finished. I double-checked the time. In text, the GPS coordinates are correct at the address of Mr. Hayes' residence. The voice on the video is his. There's no question about it. No objections were raised. None that would stand anyway. The proof was evident. Hayes had handed Clarence a package, told him not to open it, ordained him to keep it under wraps, and that package, now found to be a box of pilfered jewels, was subsequently found by the police following an anonymous tip. And now, the sting was collapsing. The courtroom hummed. Chaperone whispers exchanged looks. Back row reporters were already hammering away on their keyboards. The judge turned to the prosecutor, who was visibly struggling to find words. "I'll have to check the tape," the prosecutor replied. "We must check the authenticity of the file." The judge nodded gravely. "You may take your time. But this sets this case on a different course, a very different course." He turned to the court officers. "I'm adjourning the court," he stated. 1 hour. We resume with technical examination and counsel for both sides." He rapped his gavel. Zariah released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Clarence finally turned to glance at her, and his mouth opened as if to say something. But nothing came. He merely shook his head slowly, as though in wonder. And in that instant, Zariah saw something in his eyes she hadn't noticed since the night of his arrest. Hope. An hour went by. When the courtroom came back in, everything was different. The defense had something to stand on now. The prosecution, something to answer to. And Clarence Thompson, for the first time since the trial started, had something to lift his chin about. Zariah had done more than just speak out. She had turned the tale around. She had brought a shrouded truth into the light. One frame, one file, one voice at a time. And as the doors shut and the judge brought the court back into session, everyone in that room knew this case would never be the same again. A week later, the charges were dismissed. Like that. No courthouse theatrics, no dramatic ruling, no Dawes office press conference. Just a quiet court record update. The documents arrived unobtrusively, as they must have hoped no one would see. But someone did see. Particularly those who had watched the case from the start. Particularly those who recalled how the media depicted Clarence Thompson as the quiet man who most likely did it. Now, he was free. The prosecution made no public apology. Mr. Hayes' attorneys declined to comment on anything. They didn't say no. Yeah, but they didn't say yes either. And when confronted by reporters, they just wrote back in an abbreviated email. No comment at this time, but insiders gossiped. They told Mr. Hayes' attorneys had swiftly gone underground, resolving issues that were never intended to see the light of day. Papers were sealed. Deals were signed. Money quietly flowed from one account to another. Whatever came next would never make the news. But Clarence's release, that did. He left the courthouse wearing the same suit he'd been arrested in. It didn't fit quite so well after weeks of sitting in a holding cell. But the expression on his face had changed. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. But his eyes were different. Softer. Lighter. Free. He walked past a line of reporters with microphones extended like fishing poles, hoping to catch something they could. One of them yelled, "Do you have anything to say, Mr. Thompson?" Clarence didn't blink. He continued on. But he did halt briefly when he spotted Zariah standing at the foot of the courthouse stairs. She had waited there all morning long. Same gray dress, different shoes this time, and a coat her mother had tied with tight buttons around her before the sun came up. She gazed up at him with the same eyes that had stood by the window waiting for his keys in the lock. But she wasn't a little girl anymore. She was the reason he was out in the sun. He stepped down to her. For an instant, they remained silent. The world outside them faded. Reporters screaming, cameras popping, cars driving by in the distance. All Clarence saw was her. "How did you do it?" He breathed, his voice shattered by weeks of quiet, disbelief still present in his voice. Zariah smiled, tiny and confident. You always said the truth speaks for itself, she replied. I just gave it a voice. He nodded slowly. No words were left, only tears in his eyes. The kind of tears a man attempts to suppress in front of strangers, but can't hide from his daughter. They hugged there on the courthouse steps. No fanfare, no applause, only a father and daughter, their way back to each other in the sunlight. Over the next few weeks, the tale slowly disappeared from the front pages. Carlisle Hayes went on temporary leave from his firm, citing personal issues. His lawyers acted quickly to tidy up what they could, recrafting the story through unnewsworthy interviews and judicious silence. But no one forgot. In the neighborhood where Clarence resided, individuals began waving once more. A few stopped by with casseroles. One neighbor cut his lawn without invitation. Another volunteered to repaint the mailbox that had been egged following the arrest. Folks were beginning to recall who he truly was. Not a thief, not a criminal, just Clarence. A man who worked hard, lived in quiet, and raised a daughter who would not allow him to be buried by another man's lie. As for Zaria, she returned to her part-time job at the library, back to studying on her bedroom floor, highlighters strewn about her like puzzle pieces. But something was different. People viewed her differently now, not only as Clarence's daughter, but as the girl who got up in court, alone. No law degree, no business suit, just a backpack, a flash drive, and a heart full of truth. The girl in the gray dress. There were rumors about her online. Some snippets of her testimony had been posted around social media, with captions such as "real hero and evidence that one voice can make a difference." She didn't pursue the attention. She didn't even desire it. She just wanted her father to be free. That was sufficient for her. And years afterwards, when folks recounted the story, they did not mention the billionaire. They did not mention the courtroom and the press and the settlement. They spoke of her. The shy girl who stood up when everyone else sat down. The daughter who did not let her father fall by himself. The one who entered court with nothing but love, bravery, and the truth. And that, just that, was enough. Because sometimes in a world with all power and noise, it's not the loudest that gets ahead. It's the one who speaks from the heart, with no shield but honesty. And on that day, in that courtroom, one voice was louder than money, than fear, than silence. Zaria Thompson gave truth a voice, and the world listened. Sometimes life does not offer us a fair fight, and the people we love most end up paying the price for someone else. Silence, or someone else's power. But every now and then, someone finds the strength to stand up, not with fists or fury, but with quiet truth. Like Zaria, she didn't wear a badge or hold a title, but what she brought was something we all possess deep within, the unbreakable urge to defend those closest to us. In times like these, we're reminded that true strength isn't necessarily loud. It's often in the quiet courage of a voice that will not be silenced, and perhaps that's what we could use more of, not perfect individuals, but brave hearts that are willing to speak at the most critical time. May her legacy remain with you, and quietly remind you, when love and truth walk hand in hand, they're enough to change everything.